Thanks so much for being with us today. Today we're beginning a brand new message series I'm very excited about. It's entitled, Better Decisions, Fewer Regrets. Now here's the deal. If you will hear each one of these messages, spend a few minutes just digesting, applying the principles that we're going to go over, I am absolutely convinced that you're going to make better decisions and have fewer regrets in life. Here's the first fill in the blank on your message outline. We often overlook the relationship between good questions and good decisions. The truth is this, look at this next fill in, that good questions set us up for good decisions. In some ways, our decisions are no better than the questions that we ask, or maybe even the questions that we don't ask. In this series, we're going to be looking at 5 different questions to ask every time you and I need to make a decision of significance or any type of magnitude. Whether it's a financial decision, relational, academic, professional, spiritual decision, I'm convinced of this, look at the fill-in, that if you will ask these questions, honestly answer the questions, and then act on the 5 questions we're going to look at, it will significantly increase the odds that you're going to end up where you ultimately want to be. And a big reason for this is something that we all know intuitively. It's the next fill in the blank. You're not the only person impacted by your decisions, and you're certainly not the only person impacted by your regrets. In fact, we have no idea who is ultimately impacted by the decisions that we make. Here's a picture of one of our founding fathers, obviously George Washington. Did you know that there was talk of making George Washington not our first president, but actually making him our king? This really never took a lot of ground, but there was some discussion about it. Imagine the direction our country would have taken if he had acted upon or even showed interest in being not a president, but actually being a king, setting up a monarchy. His refusal to even entertain this has impacted us and played out now for generations. Here's another picture of a great American, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. What if Dr. King had decided to stay up north and remain silent about what he knew was taking place in the South? The aftermath of that decision continues to play out even today. And then here's another picture for you. Who is that person? You say, I don't know. Well, I'm surprised you don't. That's a picture of my father. My dad grew up in a small little town of less than 1,000 people. His father was a mail carrier. His mom was a homemaker. She had 3 boys. My dad was the youngest of the 3. None of my father's family members had ever been to college. My oldest uncle, my dad's oldest brother, he eventually took over the mail route for his dad, my granddad. And then the second brother wound up moving to Birmingham, and he worked all of his life in a steel mill in Birmingham. And then my dad came along. My dad wanted something different. He wanted something better. His ticket to get out of that small town environment, perhaps to go to college, was through sports, through athletics. He was a star athlete at his small little town. He received a scholarship to attend the University of Alabama, where he played football and he also played baseball. And now for many of you, you know why the Crimson Tide blood runs deep in our family. My dad certainly wasn't a star, but he was on the 1941 national championship team at Alabama. He was at Alabama for about 3 years, and then he entered World War II. He was an officer in the U.S. Army, served overseas in Europe and also in the Pacific arena as well. When the war ended, he came back to Alabama. He now had the GI Bill, and he no longer needed that football scholarship to go through school, so he concentrated on his academics. He graduated from Alabama, and then he entered into the first class, dental class ever at the University of Alabama, Birmingham. He graduated in 1952 from that, practiced dentistry for the next 35 to 40 years after that. I want you to understand this, that my dad's decision for a better life, to go to college and to pursue a different type of career, changed the whole trajectory of my family. It changed our family tree, literally, because of the decisions that he made in his life. Let me ask you this, how different would your life be if maybe your grandparents or your parents had made some different decisions? Maybe for some of you, how different would your life be if your father had chose to maybe stop drinking? How different would some of your lives be if your mom had not decided to walk out on your family? But the opposite is also true for some of you. Your family was blessed because your dad conquered his habit of drinking. It kept your family together. Your mom chose to stay when any other woman would have walked away from that relationship. The point I'm trying to make, the point I want you to understand is this. Look at this fill in. We never know what or who hangs in the balance of the decisions that we make. But here's one thing that we do know. Look at this fill in. Private decisions always have public outcomes. Private decisions always have public outcomes. I tried to think of a biblical example of someone whose decisions really impacted a lot of people. And the person I kept coming back to was a person we refer to as King David. You may remember a few months ago, we actually did a small, brief message series on the life of King David. I've given you something that is going to be on our screen. It's not on your outline, so please don't think you're missing anything. Just to kind of outline his life and some crucial decisions and how that impacted so many different people. We know that when David was a young boy, he was a devout follower of God. He truly loved God with all of his heart. When he was only a teenager, he had the epic fight with Goliath and killed the Philistine giant. But we know that he was also secretly anointed to be the king, but he didn't actually become the king until probably another 10, 15 years after that. When he did become king, we begin to see some major flaws in his own personal life. We know of the incident where his armies were out fighting a war, and yet David remained in Jerusalem. This was very unusual because at that time the king was the military leader. He was always leading the troops, but for some reason David had stayed back in Jerusalem. He was walking out on his court, or if you would, kind of like a patio or courtyard, or more like a terrace, if you would, an upstairs terrace. He looks out over and into an adjoining property, sees a beautiful woman taking a bath. He lusts after her. He asks who is the woman, finds out it's one of his army officers' wives. He sends for her. Her name is Bathsheba. She's brought into the palace. He has an affair with Bathsheba. He thinks it's kind of a one and done thing and it's all over. She goes back. Nobody will really ever know, until finally she sends him several weeks later a note saying that she's pregnant with his child. David tries to cover things up. When that doesn't happen, he ultimately has her husband, Bathsheba's husband Uriah, murdered on the battlefield. As a result of their illicit relationship, one of the judgments that were brought against them, the baby dies, we're told, shortly after birth. We know that David had other wives, other sons as well. He had other sons even with Bathsheba. But as those sons begin to grow up, we know that one of his sons, named Amnon, rapes his half-sister Tamar. And during this whole time, we're told David does absolutely nothing. So one of David's other sons, Absalom, takes up for his younger sister. He spends 2 to 3 years plotting the murder of the one who had raped his half-sister. And ultimately, he murders his son, his step-brother, Amnon. After this, we see that Absalom tries to overthrow David and become king. This creates a civil war in the nation. David has to flee Jerusalem. Ultimately, David's army defeats Absalom's army. 20,000 of Absalom's soldiers die. We do not know how many of David's men died in that battlefield. Absalom himself is killed in the battle. We know that several years later, David takes a census of the people against God's will. As a result of this, a disease hits the land and 70,000 people die. I'm simply using this to illustrate the point that we made earlier, that we never know what or who hangs in the balance of decisions that we make. But we do know this: private decisions always have public outcomes. But I am confident that if you and I will simply ask questions about decisions we're about to make, honestly answer those questions, and then act on our answers, your fingerprints are going to be all over a future that's worth celebrating. Because this is not just about you. It's about future generations as well. And perhaps the most significant thing you may ever do is something you don't necessarily do, but it's someone that you raise. That might be the most significant thing you and I ever do. You see, your decisions, my decisions, determine the direction and the quality of our lives. Someone has correctly said that our decisions are almost like a steering wheel. And we know that on a car steering wheel, wherever you turn that steering wheel, that's the direction that car is going. In a similar way, the directions that you and I make are going to steer our lives in the direction of those decisions, whether they be good or whether they not be good. We are where we are because of the decisions that we have made. But some of you may at this point say, well, wait a minute, you just mentioned that we're influenced by other people and we don't really have any control over their decisions. That is true to a certain extent, but look at this next fill in the blank. We need to understand this. Our responses are actually decisions, and you and I decide how we will respond. We choose our responses. And this is how some people are able to rise above or avoid a victim mentality. Every one of us probably knows some people who have just been dealt an incredibly difficult hand in life. They incur some incredible hardships that they have no control over whatsoever. But yet somehow some of these people are able to rise above their circumstances and accomplish incredible things. There are people who have every reason to be bitter, to be angry, to even be self-destructive if you would. But again, they're able to rise above that. Why? What enables them to do that? And the answer is this: it's the decisions that they make. They make decisions. They decide rather than react their way into a future. They take the time to respond, and in doing so, they create for themselves and their family a preferred future. Would you agree with this next fill in the blank? That a response creates a better path forward than simply a reaction. I don't know about you, but rarely do I ever have to apologize for a well thought out response. But many times when I simply react, I find myself needing to apologize to someone. Reactions generally make a situation work. They create regrets. But a thoughtful response generally creates a bridge to move forward in our relationships. When we react, what we do in many cases, we actually kind of relinquish control of our own story. It's almost like handing a pen to our enemy and allowing them to write the next chapter in the life of our story. We need to never underestimate the power of a measured response, a well thought out response. We need to never forget that our responses are indeed, they are our decisions. If you and I will pause to ask one of these 5 questions that we're going to be looking at, that we'll be discussing in these next 5 weeks together, that pause will create the margin you need to respond rather than to react. We are where we are because of the decisions that we have made. We are headed in the direction we are headed in also for the same reason, because of the decisions that we have made. Your decisions, my decisions, determine the story of our life. And if by chance you don't like the story that's being written about your life, or maybe there's a chapter you're on right now that you don't like, I want you to understand this. You can decide a good story. You can change the trajectory of where your story is going. Now, I don't know about you, but I hate it when I ask people to tell me what I should do, and they don't tell me what I should do, but instead they ask me a question. I absolutely hate that. It may be a parent, maybe it's a friend, maybe it's a counselor, and I just want somebody, just tell me what to do, and that's what I'm going to do. But instead of telling me, they ask questions. Maybe they would ask a question maybe like this: well, what would you do if I wasn't here to tell you what to do? To which you and I would probably say, but you are here, so that's why I want you to tell me what to do. Just tell me. Or maybe they ask you this question: what do you think would be a wise thing to do in this situation? And immediately that eliminates most of our preferred options when we think about that. And maybe you wonder, why are you doing this to me? Why don't you just help me out and just tell me what you think I should do? And the answer to that is probably this: they're probably more interested in teaching you how to make good decisions rather than in making the decisions for you. Why? Because good questions lead to better decisions, and better decisions lead to fewer regrets. But notice, this is not an automatic. Notice the big if here. This only happens if you and I will ask those questions, if we will honestly answer those questions, and then if we will act on our answers. How many times have you made a decision that you regretted, you look back on it, and maybe you made this statement: I should have asked more questions. I should have asked more questions. And the reason we say that, because we intuitively know if we ask a lot of questions, we generally make better decisions. But here's the irony in this. Most of us resist uninvited questions. especially when we feel like we're kind of being questioned, almost like we're kind of being interrogated, if you would. And when that happens, all of a sudden our defenses go up, our aptitude for learning certainly goes down, and it's almost impossible for us to welcome new information, new insights, if we feel like our judgment is being questioned by someone else. We kind of step back and we kind of think this: it's none of your business. It's none of your business. A good counselor knows this, that it's far more likely for you and I to take and follow through on a decision that we make versus decisions that others give to us. Most of us are familiar with the name Ken Blanchard. Several years ago, he was one of the leading writers in America today. He spit out book after book. I loved his books because they were so short. They always told a story, but they had incredible principles. Maybe you read some of them: The 1 Minute Manager, Who Moved the Cheese, Raving Fans. I don't know which book it was, but I remember one of the key points to his book was this: when you're helping someone make decisions or guide someone, always try to make sure that they believe whatever decision is reached, they're the ones who came to that conclusion and not you. Why? Because the same principle we're talking about here comes into play. We're far more apt to follow through on decisions that we make versus decisions someone else tells us. There's no getting around a well-placed, appropriately timed, thought-provoking question. They set us up for better decisions and fewer regrets in our lives. So here's the question for you. What if we had some of those questions ahead of time? What if we had them ahead of time? A list of questions that you could ask yourself when you're faced with an important decision. That's the whole purpose of this message series. We're going to be looking each week for the next 5 weeks at 5 different questions that will help us form, if you would, almost like a grid to filter major decisions through. Now, every one of us already have a grid to filter options through. Whenever you and I make a decision, we run it through our grid and we ask some very common questions. Questions kind of like, will I enjoy this? Will this hurt anybody? Will it hurt someone else? Will it hurt me? What if somebody finds out about it? And then the all-important question, if somebody finds out about it, what will I say? What will I do? We filter decisions through our mind, and we have kind of like a system that we go through. Now, I have an object for you here to show you, and some of you are saying, what is this thing on your desk here? Well, this is something that you probably don't have in your home. Now, if depending on your age, if you were older, probably your parents had one of these. If you're younger, probably your grandparents had one, your grandmother had one. This is called a flour sifter. Back in the day when they would buy a bag of flour, I know my mom had one, so I'm going to say back in the 1960s, a lot of times when you open that bag of flour, it would be in big clumps. You needed to break it up in order to bake something. Some of you today, if you've ever made a pack of gravy out of a little packet, when you poured it in the water, it was kind of clumped up. What did you have to do? You have to stir it so that the clumps break apart. Well, the same thing. This is a flour sifter, and it has the handle on it, and it has a grid inside. And every time I pull the lever here, it turns and it sifts inside the flour and makes it go down through a little wire mesh piece, and it breaks up any clumps. So this was a needed thing. And so what you have at the end, it kind of looks like snow falling there. You have some finely now flour that has been through the sifter, and you don't have to worry about any lumps. What we're trying to do by giving you these 5 questions, we're trying to add 5 more elements to the sifter in your mind, the grid in your mind that you filter questions through. And the same thing is true with the flour sifter. If you use it, you're going to come up with some finely, in our case, some finely tuned answers in our lives to help us. Before we get to those 5 questions beginning next week, I have a homework assignment for you. It's simply to memorize one verse of Scripture. It's a passage found in the Old Testament, but it's a passage that is a huge part in making decisions as far as filtering them through the system that we're talking about. This verse will keep us getting stuck in a ditch, if you would. Here's the verse, Proverbs 27, verse 12. The wisdom writer says this: the prudent see danger and they take refuge. Now, the word prudent here is not a word that we use in everyday life. What does it mean? Well, it simply means someone who's wise, someone who's crafty, someone who's shrewd, someone who's sensible. So here's a question for you. Are you a prudent person? A prudent person's able to connect the dots. They realize that today's decisions show up in tomorrow's outcomes. They show up in our relationships, in our finances, in our workplace, in our spiritual life. They show up. A prudent or a wise person, look at the fill in the blank. A prudent or a wise person sees something up ahead that has the potential to rob them of their preferred future, their future hopes and dreams. And so what do? They respond appropriately. Now let me try to give you the best illustration I can on this. Here's a picture for you. Now every one of us have come across a picture like this. It's a roadblock in a road. It says bridge out ahead. It doesn't say the bridge is closed, the bridge is out. It means part of the bridge is no longer there. You can't cross it. The bridge is out, so it says take a detour. Take a detour to avoid the bridge that is broken down. Now here's the thing. We are told that the prudent person sees danger and they take refuge. So what does the prudent person does? What do they do when they see that sign? They take the detour. They take the detour. Here's the second part of the verse. We're told that the prudent person sees danger. They take refuge. But then notice this, the simple person. Now, what is the simple? Who's he talking about there? He's talking about someone who is naive, someone who believes most anything, someone who doesn't ask questions, someone who doesn't connect the dots in life. They don't slow down to think. In fact, the one word that I would just summarize the simple person, I would use the word the foolish person. Notice what it says they do. They keep going and they pay the penalty. Here's a picture, another picture. Here's where they wind up. When they ignore the detour sign, they go around it and they keep going. And here's what they think. They think that everyone, that what happens, that sign, it applies to everyone but me. This will happen to everyone else, but it won't happen to me. And they wind up with their car in the water. The foolish person keeps going. And there's another translation that says, and they suffer for it. They pay the penalty. Now, if you're watching at home with someone, I want you just to look at them, turn and look at them, and with all the love you can muster up in your eyes, I want you just to say to them this: don't be a fool. Don't be a fool. The prudent sees danger. They take refuge. They take the detour. But the simple keep going, and they pay the penalty. The foolish person keeps on going, and they think this doesn't apply to me, but it applies to everyone else. I want us just to say, look on your message outline. Let's say the verse, Proverbs 27:12. Let's read it out loud together. I'm asking you to memorize this verse. It's going to help us through this series. The prudent sees danger, and they do what? They take refuge. But the simple keeps going, and they pay the penalty. Look at this next fill in the blank. If you will just incorporate the 5 questions into your decision-making filter, they will slow you down. They'll create the perspective that you need to see danger coming up ahead. They will again create the margin that you need to stop and you need to think. You need to connect those dots. You need to get your passions, your desires, your fears in their proper perspective. And maybe most important of all, look at this fill in the blank. If you ask these 5 questions consistently, not only will you make better decisions, live with fewer regrets, be better off, but notice this: the people who look to you, who depend on you, who need you, will be better off as well. Last fill in. Remember, your decisions determine the direction and the quality of your life. And we never know who is affected by the decisions that we make. If you look at your next steps for today, let me just quickly go over them with you. I'm asking you, first of all, make a commitment to hear these next messages. And you may say, well, I already know I'm going to be out of town one week. Well, you can watch online. You can go to the archive section and you can pull this message up. Commit to see all 5 messages. Don't miss a one. And then I'm asking you, as I already mentioned, to memorize Proverbs 27:12. The prudent sees danger and he takes refuge, but the simple keeps going and they suffer or pay the penalty because of it. And then here's some questions to keep the conversation going. If you're in a life group, you'll be discussing these. If you're not in a life group, find somebody and discuss these 3 questions. Here's the first one. Can you think of a decision that led to regret that could have been avoided if you had either asked more questions or seriously considered questions someone else asked you? Here's the second question. What makes the salesperson in your head so convincing? Why do you know better, but we don't decide better? And then a third question. Have you ever seen trouble coming but kept moving in that direction anyway? Have you ever seen trouble coming and taken refuge? What made the difference? I certainly hope you'll be with us next week as we continue on asking the first question. It's the integrity question. My guess is you probably thought of someone, a friend you know right now that needs to hear this series. I want to encourage you, invite them either to come here to church with you or to see the message online with you. I don't think you'll regret it, and I don't think they'll regret it either. Let's close in prayer. Father, would you give us eyes to see, give us ears to hear, give us the courage to act. And Father, for the couple, for the individual, maybe even for the student in the middle of a big decision right now, God, would you give them the insight they need to be prudent, to be wise. And for those who see danger coming, but something in them wants to keep going, God, would you give them the courage to step away, to pause, to listen to questions that people are asking them, maybe even to ask questions, maybe to ask questions that they're afraid to ask. That God, that those things might move them in a different direction. Father, we thank you for caring for us. We thank you for being our refuge. Help us, God. Help us. Please help us to ask these types of questions that will lead us to better decisions and fewer regrets. It's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen.